The moment I realized my family hadn't forgotten to invite me to Thanksgiving, but had deliberately left me out, something inside me went quiet. Not angry, not dramatic, just quiet. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 68 years old, a widow, a mother, a grandmother, and until that Thanksgiving, I believed family was something you could always count on. The morning began the way it always had. I woke up before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, and stood by the kitchen window watching the cold November light spread across the neighborhood. The air outside looked crisp enough to bite. Inside, my house was warm, filled with the smell of cinnamon and the pumpkin pie I had baked the night before. I wasn't hosting Thanksgiving that year. Nicole, my daughter-in-law, had insisted on taking over. She said it was time for the younger generation to create traditions of their own. I smiled when she said it. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Jason had told me they would let me know what time dinner started. So I waited. I spent the morning reading, folding laundry, and checking my phone more often than I'd like to admit. Noon came and went. Then 1 o'clock. Then 2. Every time my screen lit up, my heart lifted for a second before dropping again. A store promotion, a weather alert, a reminder about a prescription refill. Nothing from my family. By 4 o'clock, the turkey breast I had bought for myself was still sitting untouched in the refrigerator. I told myself they were busy. Maybe dinner had been pushed back. Maybe someone forgot to send the group message. Families make mistakes. That's what I kept telling myself. As evening settled in, I heated a bowl of soup instead. The house felt larger than usual. Too quiet. The ticking clock above the stove seemed louder with every passing minute. I carried my soup into the living room and sat in my favorite chair. My phone rested on the table beside me. Silent. At 7:30 that night, I opened Facebook. I wish I hadn't. The first thing that appeared on my screen was a photograph posted less than an hour earlier. There was Jason. There was Nicole. There was Sophie, smiling between them. My brother-in-law and his wife were there too. So were several cousins. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked relaxed. Behind them stretched a long dining table covered with Thanksgiving food. The caption beneath the picture read, "Perfect Thanksgiving with the people who matter most." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I looked through the rest of the photos. There were dozens. Family portraits, toasts, laughter, group pictures in front of a stone fireplace. Nobody looked worried. Nobody looked like they were waiting for someone who hadn't arrived. Because they weren't. I wasn't late. I wasn't forgotten. I was never invited. My chest felt tight, but I didn't cry. Instead, I enlarged one of the photographs. In the background, through a wall of windows, I recognized something immediately. The ocean, the dunes, the familiar wooden deck overlooking the shoreline. My beach house. The beach house my late husband and I had purchased nearly 30 years earlier. The beach house that belonged to me. They were celebrating Thanksgiving there. Without me. I set my phone down and looked around my silent living room. The candles I had lit that afternoon had burned low. The pie sat untouched on the counter. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows. For the first time all day, everything made sense. The missed calls that never came. The holidays I somehow always seemed to miss. The family plans I learned about after they happened. Each memory felt like another puzzle piece clicking into place. I wasn't looking at one painful evening. I was looking at years of quiet exclusion. And as I sat there alone, staring at the fading candlelight, I realized something even more troubling. If they felt comfortable celebrating at my beach house without inviting me, what else had they started treating as theirs? That night, I did not sleep very much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photographs again. The smiles, the raised glasses, the caption. By morning, the shock had settled into something colder. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where the early sunlight stretched across the wood grain. For years, I had convinced myself that certain things were accidents. People were busy. Schedules changed. Children grew up. Families drifted. That was what I told myself whenever I felt a little left out. Looking back, I realized how much effort I had spent protecting other people from responsibility. The signs had been there for a long time. I just had not wanted to see them. 3 years earlier, Sophie had a school awards ceremony. I found out about it from a photograph online. Jason apologized and said the invitation must have gotten lost in the mail. The following Christmas, Nicole organized a family gathering at a rented cabin in the mountains. I learned about it 2 days after everyone returned home. She said they assumed I already had plans. The year after that, there was a birthday dinner for my nephew. Every relative attended except me. Nicole claimed there had been a misunderstanding with the guest list. At the time, each explanation sounded possible. Standing alone, none of those moments seemed important enough to question. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I finished my coffee and walked through the house. The silence felt different now, less lonely, more revealing. I stopped beside a framed photograph of my late husband, Richard. He had been gone for almost 6 years. Richard was the kind of man who noticed things. Small things. A forced smile. An uncomfortable silence. A conversation that ended too quickly when someone entered the room. Sometimes I wondered what he would have seen long before I did. The thought stayed with me for the rest of the day. Around noon, I opened an old photo album stored in the living room cabinet. Page after page showed family gatherings from happier years. Barbecues, birthdays, beach weekends, Christmas mornings. In nearly every picture, the beach house appeared somewhere in the background. It had always been more than property. Richard and I bought it when Jason was still a teenager. We spent years fixing it up ourselves. We painted walls, repaired decks, replaced windows. Every improvement came from our savings and countless weekends of work. We never viewed it as an investment. We viewed it as a place where family memories would live. Then I remembered something Nicole had said. The previous summer, we had been sitting on the deck watching the ocean when she casually referred to the house as our future vacation place. At the time, I laughed because I thought she was joking. Now I was not so sure. Another memory surfaced. Jason discussing renovations nobody had asked my permission to make. Nicole talking about furniture she wanted to replace. Sophie mentioning future family trips scheduled months in advance. They spoke as though ownership was simply a matter of time, as though my presence was temporary. I closed the album and stared out the window. For the first time, a question formed clearly in my mind. It was not why they excluded me. The answer to that was beginning to reveal itself. The real question was how long they had been planning a future that no longer included me at all. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about the beach house more than I had in years. Not because of the property itself, but because of what it represented. Richard and I had poured so much of our lives into that place that every room seemed to hold a memory. I could still picture him standing on a ladder near the front porch, paint on his hands and a smile on his face. I could still hear the sound of Sophie laughing as a little girl while she chased seagulls across the sand. For decades, that house had been where birthdays were celebrated, holidays were shared, and family photographs were taken. It was supposed to be a place that brought people together. Somehow, it had become something else. The following Saturday, I drove down to the coast. The trip took a little over 2 hours. The weather was cool, and the sky was covered with gray clouds that made the ocean look almost silver. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed several tire tracks in the gravel. That alone was not unusual. What caught my attention was how fresh they looked. I stepped out of the car and stood quietly for a moment. The wind carried the smell of salt water across the dunes. Normally, arriving there filled me with peace. This time, I felt uneasy. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The furniture was in place. The walls were unchanged. The framed photographs remained exactly where I had left them. Then I noticed small things. A decorative bowl that had been moved to a different shelf. A blanket folded in a way I did not recognize. Coffee mugs drying beside the sink. Someone had been there recently. I moved slowly through the house, taking in details I might have ignored before. In the guest bedroom, the closet door was slightly open. Inside, I found several shopping bags filled with beach toys and supplies. None of them belonged to me. In another bedroom, I discovered a stack of brochures for local attractions and restaurants. Most were less than 3 months old. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at them. Nobody had mentioned using the house. Nobody had asked permission. Nobody had even told me they were there. As the afternoon passed, more memories surfaced. I remembered Jason calling one summer to ask if he could spend a weekend at the beach with friends. Back then, he always asked. He always thanked me afterward. Somewhere along the way, those conversations had stopped. The requests disappeared. The gratitude disappeared. The assumption remained. By early evening, I walked out onto the deck overlooking the water. The tide rolled in steadily beneath the fading light. I wrapped my sweater tighter and sat in one of the old wooden chairs Richard had built years ago. For a long time, I simply listened to the waves. Then another memory returned. A conversation from the previous spring. Nicole had been discussing future vacation plans and casually said, "The house will eventually stay in the family anyway." At the time, I smiled and changed the subject. Now those words sounded different. They sounded less like a hope and more like an expectation. As darkness settled over the shoreline, I realized something important. The problem was not that my family enjoyed the beach house. The problem was that they had begun acting as though it already belonged to them. And the more I thought about it, the more I wondered how many decisions had already been made without me knowing. When I returned home from the coast, I could not stop thinking about the small details I had noticed. None of them were dramatic on their own. A blanket folded differently, new brochures, shopping bags that did not belong to me. Yet together they told a story. Someone had become comfortable treating my property as an extension of their own life. A few days later, I received an unexpected phone call from Linda Brooks. Linda had been my closest friend for more than 30 years. She was one of those rare people who spoke honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. We spent a few minutes talking about ordinary things before her voice changed. She hesitated. Then she asked a question that immediately caught my attention. "Evelyn, how are you feeling about everything they have planned for the beach house?" For a moment, I did not answer. I simply stared out the kitchen window. "What do you mean?" I finally asked. There was silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that appears when someone suddenly realizes they know something they should not know. Linda sounded confused. "I thought Jason told you." My stomach tightened. "Told me what?" Another pause followed. Then she carefully explained. A few weeks earlier, she attended a charity luncheon where she happened to sit near Nicole. During the conversation, Nicole spoke enthusiastically about future family plans. She described renovations she wanted to make. She talked about expanding the deck, replacing furniture, and updating several rooms. According to Linda, she spoke as if the decisions had already been approved, as if ownership was already settled. I listened without interrupting. My coffee grew cold beside me. Linda continued. She explained that someone at the table had asked whether the property belonged to Jason and Nicole. Nicole laughed and replied, "Not yet, but eventually it will. We are already thinking ahead." Linda said the comment had bothered her at the time, but she assumed the family had discussed everything together. She assumed I was part of those conversations. The truth was that nobody had mentioned any of it to me. After the call ended, I remained at the table for a long time. The house was completely quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Nothing else. My mind replayed dozens of conversations from the past few years. Small comments that once seemed harmless now carried a different meaning. Nicole asking whether I planned to keep the property forever. Jason wondering how expensive long-term maintenance might become. Casual questions about insurance policies, property taxes, future plans. At the time, I believed they were showing interest. Now I wondered whether they were gathering information. Later that afternoon, I opened a desk drawer and removed a folder containing documents related to the property. I reviewed tax records, insurance papers, maintenance receipts, and ownership information. Everything remained exactly as it should be. Legally, nothing had changed. Yet the feeling would not leave me. Somewhere along the way, my family had stopped seeing me as the owner and started seeing me as an obstacle standing between them and something they wanted. That realization hurt more than being excluded from a holiday dinner. Because holidays come and go, a forgotten invitation can be explained away. But when people begin planning a future around your absence, that is something entirely different. The next week, I stopped searching for explanations and started paying attention to facts. Emotions could be dismissed. Facts could not. Every morning, I spent an hour reviewing old emails, text messages, and documents connected to the beach house. At first, I expected to find very little. Instead, I discovered a pattern that became harder to ignore with every passing day. There were confirmation emails for service appointments I had never scheduled. A landscaping company had visited the property twice during the summer. The contact number listed was not mine. There were receipts for minor repairs that had been approved without anyone mentioning them to me. None of the expenses were large, but that was not the point. Decisions were being made. Access was being granted. People were acting on behalf of a property they did not own. One afternoon, I called a local maintenance company that had worked on the house for years. The manager recognized my name immediately. We exchanged pleasantries. Before I casually asked when they had last serviced the property, he checked his records and gave me several dates. Then he mentioned something unexpected. "Your son has been handling most of the requests lately." I thanked him and ended the call. For a long moment, I sat staring at the phone in my hand. Jason had never told me he was managing anything. I had never asked him to. That evening, I opened a notebook and began writing down everything I had learned. Dates, conversations, small details. The more information I gathered, the clearer the picture became. Nobody had stolen anything. Nobody had broken any laws. Yet an invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer treating the beach house as my property that they occasionally enjoyed. They were treating it as their future property that I happened to occupy in the present. A few days later, another surprise arrived. While sorting through a stack of mail, I found a brochure from a luxury retirement community about 30 miles from my home. Normally, I would have thrown it away without thinking. What caught my attention was the handwritten note attached to it. Someone had circled several floor plans and highlighted pricing information. There was no signature, no explanation, just markings. At first, I assumed it had been sent by mistake. Then I remembered a conversation from the previous year. Nicole had spent nearly 20 minutes discussing retirement communities and how convenient they could be for older adults. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Now I wondered if she had been testing an idea. That realization stayed with me. The following weekend, I drove to the coast again. The beach was nearly empty. Winter had chased away most visitors. I unlocked the front door and walked through the house room by room. Everything looked peaceful. The framed family photographs remained in place. Richard's old reading chair still sat beside the window overlooking the water. Yet something felt different. I finally understood why. For years, I had viewed this house as a symbol of family. Jason and Nicole appeared to view it as an asset waiting to change hands. Those were two very different things. As I stood on the deck watching the waves roll toward shore, another thought entered my mind. If they were comfortable making plans without me, there was a good chance they were having conversations I had never heard. And for the first time, I decided I needed to find out exactly how far those conversations had gone. The answer arrived when I was not looking for it. About 10 days after my second trip to the coast, I attended a community fundraising dinner at a local civic center. It was the kind of event Richard and I used to support every year. Familiar faces filled the room. Neighbors, business owners, retired teachers, people I had known for decades. I spent most of the evening moving from table to table, exchanging greetings and catching up with old friends. Near the end of the event, I found myself speaking with a man named Carl Henderson. Carl had worked in real estate for nearly 30 years. We were discussing coastal property values when he casually mentioned that he had recently spoken with a young couple interested in beachfront investments. Normally, I would not have thought twice about the comment. Then he mentioned the location, my beach house. I felt my heartbeat slow rather than speed up. Who was asking about it? I said. Carl looked surprised. I assumed you knew. Jason and Nicole stopped by my office a few months ago. Nothing official, just questions. I smiled politely and asked him to continue. According to Carl, they wanted information about renovation costs, long-term market projections, and resale potential. They were especially interested in understanding how much value certain improvements might add over the next decade. Carl emphasized that they never claimed ownership. They simply spoke with unusual confidence about the property's future. After our conversation ended, I thanked him and returned home. That night, I sat alone in my living room and replayed every detail. For months, perhaps even years, plans had been developing beyond my view. Nobody had asked what I wanted. Nobody had included me in the discussions. Yet decisions were already being imagined. Futures were already being mapped out. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Sophie called unexpectedly after school. We chatted about classes, friends, and her upcoming exams. Then she mentioned something that caught my attention immediately. She asked whether I was excited about the new design ideas for the upstairs bedrooms. I gently asked what she meant. Sophie sounded confused. She explained that her parents had spent several weekends discussing future changes to the house. Nicole wanted lighter colors. Jason wanted larger windows facing the water. Sophie even described a conversation about turning one of the guest rooms into a private office. She spoke innocently, unaware of how significant her words were. To her, these were simply family discussions. To me, they revealed something else entirely. When the call ended, I remained seated at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. I was not angry anymore. Anger requires surprise. By then, surprise had faded. What remained was clarity. For the first time, I understood the full picture. Jason and Nicole were not waiting to see what happened in the future. In their minds, the future had already arrived. They were decorating it, planning it, organizing it. The only problem was that I was still part of the present. As I looked around my quiet house, I thought about Richard. He had always believed that people reveal their intentions long before they reveal their actions. The signs had been there all along. I simply had not wanted to read them. Now I could, and once I saw the truth clearly, I knew something had to change. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted conflict, but because if I did nothing, they would continue building plans around an assumption that was never theirs to make. The decision was made on a quiet Tuesday morning. There was no dramatic moment, no argument, no confrontation. I simply woke up knowing that if I continued pretending everything was normal, nothing would ever change. The following day, I drove to the coast before sunrise. The roads were nearly empty. Gray clouds drifted above the ocean, and a cold wind moved across the dunes. As I unlocked the front door, I paused for a moment inside the entryway. The house felt exactly as it always had. Calm, familiar, steady. For years, I had viewed that feeling as something permanent. Now I understood that permanence requires protection. I spent the morning walking through every room. The guest bedrooms, the kitchen, the living room where Richard and I used to spend winter evenings listening to storms roll in from the water. Each space carried memories. None of those memories belonged to anyone else. Around 10 o'clock, a local security company arrived. I had scheduled the appointment the previous week. The technician was professional and efficient. He inspected every door, every lock, and every entry point. Together, we reviewed options for updated security systems and electronic monitoring. I listened carefully and selected exactly what I wanted. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic, just control, real control. By noon, new locks were being installed throughout the property. Fresh keys replaced old ones. Access codes were changed. Entry records were updated. For the first time in years, I knew exactly who could enter the house and who could not. As I watched the work being completed, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Relief. The feeling surprised me because I had spent weeks expecting anger. Instead, the opposite happened. The more practical steps I took, the less emotional everything became. This was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about boundaries. Later that afternoon, I met with my attorney, Robert Green, whose office was located a few miles inland. Robert had handled legal matters for Richard and me for many years. After reviewing several documents, he asked a simple question. What outcome are you hoping to achieve? I thought about it carefully before answering. I want my intentions to be clear, I said. Robert nodded. We spent more than an hour discussing ownership protections, estate planning, and long-term options. He explained every possibility in plain language. When the meeting ended, I left with a much stronger understanding of how to safeguard what Richard and I had built together. As the sun began to set, I returned to the house one final time before driving home. The ocean stretched across the horizon in shades of blue and silver. Waves rolled steadily toward shore. Everything looked peaceful. I sat on the deck and watched the water for nearly an hour. My phone remained silent beside me. No messages, no calls, no explanations. Strangely, I preferred it that way. I was no longer interested in excuses. Actions had already revealed more than words ever could. Before leaving, I locked the front door and slipped the new key into my pocket. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed softly in the evening air. It was a small sound, almost insignificant. Yet standing there beneath the fading light, I realized it represented something much larger. For the first time in a very long while, the future of that house was being determined by its owner again. 3 days later, the first phone call arrived. I was folding laundry when my phone began ringing across the room. Jason's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for several seconds before letting it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, another call came. Then a text message. Then another. None of them sounded angry at first. They sounded confused. Jason wrote that they had driven to the coast for the weekend and could not get inside the house. He assumed there had been a problem with the lock. Nicole sent a message asking whether I had recently changed the security system. I placed the phone face down on the table and continued with my afternoon. For weeks, I had lived with questions nobody bothered to answer. Waiting a few hours for theirs did not seem unreasonable. By evening, there were 6 missed calls and several new messages. The tone had changed. Confusion was slowly becoming frustration. Jason wanted to know why nobody had been informed. Nicole asked whether the new security company had made a mistake. One message even suggested that I should send them a spare key immediately so they could continue their stay. I read every word carefully. What struck me was not what they said. It was what they did not say. Nobody asked whether I was doing well. Nobody mentioned Thanksgiving. Nobody acknowledged the months of exclusion. The entire conversation revolved around access. Access to the house. Access to the property. Access to something they expected to use. The next morning, I finally responded. My message was short. I explained that the locks and security systems had been updated as part of routine property management. I added that future visits would need to be arranged directly with me in advance. Nothing more, nothing less. The reply arrived almost immediately. Jason called again. This time I answered. For a few moments, neither of us said much. Then he asked why such a decision had been made without discussing it with him first. The question hung in the air between us. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it revealed so much. Without raising my voice, I reminded him that the property belonged to me. Decisions regarding the house had always been mine to make. A long silence followed. Eventually, he said he thought the family had always treated the place as a shared space. I understood what he meant. For years, I had encouraged everyone to enjoy it. Birthdays, summer weekends, family gatherings. The difference was that shared use had gradually transformed into assumed ownership. One was a gift, the other was an expectation. After the call ended, several days passed without contact. The silence felt strange at first, then it felt peaceful. During that time, I received notification from the new security system whenever someone approached the property. Twice, I watched recorded footage of Jason and Nicole arriving at the house and leaving shortly afterward. Neither attempted to contact me while they were there. Neither asked permission beforehand. Seeing those alerts only confirmed what I already knew. They still viewed access as something automatic. They still expected the door to open simply because they arrived. As winter settled along the coast, I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what needed to happen next. The locks had changed. The access codes had changed. But there was one thing that still required attention. The future itself. And I had finally reached the point where I was ready to decide exactly what that future would look like. A week before Christmas, I met with Robert one final time. The paperwork was already prepared. We reviewed every page carefully. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was emotional. Every decision reflected exactly what I wanted. For years, I had avoided thinking about long-term planning because it felt uncomfortable. After everything that had happened, I realized avoiding those conversations only allowed other people to have them for me. By the end of the meeting, the future of the beach house was no longer based on assumptions. It was protected by clear instructions. Ownership would remain under a trust with specific conditions. No one would automatically inherit control. No one would gain access simply because they expected it. The property would remain preserved according to the values Richard and I shared when we first purchased it. Walking out of Robert's office, I felt lighter than I had in months. The following weekend, Jason called and asked if we could meet. We chose a small cafe halfway between our homes. The afternoon was cold, and holiday decorations filled the streets outside. When he arrived, he looked tired, older somehow. We sat across from each other for several moments before either of us spoke. Eventually, he asked the question I knew was coming. He wanted to understand why everything had changed. I listened quietly. Then I told him the truth. I explained how it felt to discover family photographs from a gathering I had never been invited to attend. I explained how many small exclusions had accumulated over the years. I explained how painful it was to realize decisions about my property had been discussed more often than conversations with me. I never raised my voice. I never accused him. I simply described what I had experienced. For the first time, Jason did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He just listened. When I finished speaking, he looked down at the table. After a long silence, he admitted that many assumptions had been made. He admitted that he should have noticed how isolated I had become. He admitted that convenience had gradually replaced consideration. Hearing those words did not erase the past. It did not need to. Accountability is not the same as a solution, but it is a beginning. We talked for nearly an hour. Some questions remained unanswered. Some wounds would take time to heal. Yet when we left the cafe, something important had changed. The conversation was finally honest. Several days later, I drove to the coast one more time. The winter sky was clear, and the ocean stretched endlessly beyond the dunes. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything was quiet. The same photographs remained on the walls. The same furniture occupied the same rooms. Yet the house felt different. Not because the building had changed, because I had changed. For too long, I measured my value by how useful I could be to other people. I thought preserving peace required endless patience. I thought generosity meant never establishing limits. Experience taught me otherwise. Healthy relationships require respect. Respect requires boundaries. And boundaries only matter when they are enforced. That evening, I carried a cup of coffee onto the deck and watched the sun disappear beyond the horizon. The air was cold enough to make me pull my coat tighter. Waves rolled steadily toward shore below. For the first time since Thanksgiving, my thoughts were completely calm. I was not sitting there as someone who had won a battle. I was sitting there as someone who had reclaimed her voice. The beach house was still standing. The ocean was still moving. Life was still unfolding one day at a time. The difference was that the future would no longer be written by assumptions made behind my back. It would be shaped by my own choices. And as darkness settled across the water, that was more than enough.